Episode 27, Chapter 25. Chapter 25.
No one has ever tried to board Rudania after driving it back into the volcano,
Unibo said, looking down into the maw of Death Mountain. The aftermath of the battle left the both of them exhausted, and they had agreed to rest for a time before beginning the climb up to the peak. In that time, Unibo had informed him that Rudania had never fought so hard before. It usually only took 2 or 3 cannon shots before it would retreat back into Death Mountain, only to emerge a few days later to cause problems again. It used to retreat for months at a time, but that changed several weeks ago. He had never seen it open its head before. That was new to Unibo, yet Link was certain that it wasn't new to him. He had seen it do it before, though the memory of its doing so was indistinct. But he was fairly certain that he knew what its purpose was, even without clear memory. They finally began the climb up to the peak of Death Mountain, which was just another chore in itself, though Unibo's presence had helped immensely. He had Link tie a rope around his waist and then went ahead, climbing with apparent ease and then helping Link do so after him. When they reached the peak, the two of them had looked down into the volcano. Rudania rested deep within it, seemingly floating atop a bed of molten lava 100 feet down or so. It had turned its head so that the open fin was angled vertically, safe from the magma that surrounded it.
Well, defeating the divine beast was just the first step,
Link said, pulling back from the volcano. Even with the fireproof elixir, leaning over into the volcano felt akin to holding his hand above a fire. It was bearable, but extremely uncomfortable. He wasn't looking forward to going in there.
Now I have to go down and destroy the monster controlling it.
Unibo shuddered, stepping back from the edge of the opening.
I hate monsters,
he said, his voice quieter now. Link placed a hand against Unibo's arm.
You don't have to come with me to do this. I don't even know how you could. You did your part, now I can do mine.
The Goron looked relieved, but then ashamed immediately afterwards.
I wish I could be brave like you, Link.
Again, with that. Link smiled slightly, shaking his head.
Unibo, I just watched you hold back a mountain's worth of lava. That took a great deal of courage. I mean, I would have been okay. I wasn't in any real danger.
Unibo said plaintively.
But I knew that if I didn't do that, then you probably would have died.
Link knew that Goron's skin was tough enough to withstand touching magma, but he somehow doubted Unibo could have survived being engulfed by it. He didn't contradict the Goron, though.
You still risked your life to save mine. I think you're a lot more like Daruk than you think.
Unibo looked down towards his feet, seemingly unsure of what to say. That suited Link fine. He didn't think he liked long goodbyes, anyway.
Wish me luck,
he said, freeing his paraglider from its leather carrying case and unfolding it. Before Unibo could say anything else, he ran forward and leaped off of the lip of Death Mountain, sailing down into its depths. The heat rising from the volcano was intense. The very air felt too hot to the touch, leaving his eyes stinging and his lungs burning with each breath. He could only imagine what it would be like if he had not downed another fireproof elixir right before reaching the peak. He had another jar in his waist pack. He squinted his eyes against the bright yellow and orange glow of the magma that pooled below him. There were no dark spots here, no cooled sections of hardened rock being swept along by the lava. This was all liquid heat. If he misjudged his descent, then Link would surely die a very painful death. No shrine of resurrection could ever hope to bring him back from that. The heat rising seemed to buoy him, slowing his descent, which gave him plenty of time to think on that fate. As he circled the interior wall of Death Mountain, he could see fissures in the rock wall where magma oozed out, contributing to the overall pool beneath him. He had to be careful not to approach too close to those magma falls, lest he or his paraglider get splashed. That would be an unfortunate way to end his adventure. So it was that Link felt a great deal of relief when his feet finally touched down on Rudania's flat upper surface, near the base of its tail. All around him, the orange glow of the magma cast dark shadows over much of the platform he stood on, leaving things silhouetted strangely in the light. Nothing moved. No one spoke. The only sound was that of the magma on all sides, bubbling lazily. Link took a slow step forward after folding and putting away his paraglider, eyes darting around to look for anything out of place. The ground beneath him suddenly fell away and he stumbled forward, his foot coming down onto a metal flooring of some kind, inset in the floor about a foot lower. He looked down, finding that the floor he now stood on looked like it was made of sheets of metal overlaid on top of each other. As he looked up and paid more attention to the ground, he noticed that, especially further out from the center of Rudania's back, there were several other sections of metal inset in the floor, including 4 circular sections, one at each of the 4 corners, where the shoulders might have been on a real lizard. He stepped back up onto the stone flooring, which he was beginning to be able to see better as his eyes adjusted to the lighting. In the center of the structure was one of the strange teardrop-shaped devices that was in the central room of Ruda. The room where he had fought the creature. He moved closer to the device, reaching a hesitant hand out to touch its surface. It was cool to the touch, regardless of the heat of the volcano. As he looked up at it, he was struck by a sudden overwhelming familiarity by this place. He had been here before. He had walked this very deck, touching this very device. He had witnessed Daruk looking at it in dismay, trying his best to understand why the ancient construction wouldn't respond to his commands in the same way that the other divine beasts had responded to their respective champions. And Link could remember his own role in helping Daruk overcome that.
I'm tellin' ya, little guy, I just can't get the hang of this thing.
Daruk said, reaching out and placing a hand against the control console. There were no visible controls on it, of course that was just what was used to establish the mental link between the divine beast and its pilots. Or so Princess Zelda claimed.
Every time I try to make it do something, it just sits there. Like a pile of rocks. Only at least I can eat a pile of rocks.
Link watched Daruk, smiling. Not everyone got to see Daruk's sulky side. Still, though, Daruk was the last of the champions who was still struggling to control his divine beast. Link had been watching Princess Zelda try for days to help him gain some measure of control over it, but she had as much difficulty as Daruk was. Still, she was patient with Daruk. It would be nice if she were as patient with him. Announcing that she would be taking a day to relax and enjoy the hot springs, and making it abundantly clear that Link was not to follow, he decided to see if he could help his old friend. He had heard Mipha talk about her own experiences in controlling her divine beast, not to mention the princess's endless prattle about why she thought Daruk was having so many problems, thinking out loud while writing in her journal, not while talking to Link, so he thought that he had a decent handle on the situation. So, he had asked Daruk to meet him at Rudania, which sat at the base of Death Mountain when not in use. Not too far from where they first met, actually, now that he reflected on it. It was a nice day with blue skies overhead, and the temperature was cooler than the earlier days they had been there.
When I'm having trouble figuring out a new sword technique or getting used to a new bow, I like to lock myself away and just practice it until I master it.
He turned back to look at Daruk.
Sometimes it takes an hour and sometimes it takes all day. I figure that you might just need to do the same thing. I dunno. The princess seems to think that I need to. What did she call it? Achieve perfect mental balance,
Link supplied in what he thought was a decent approximation of her accent.
Right. I need to do that with Rudania.
Daruk frowned, looking at the control device.
Just wish I could make diamonds or quartz of what that meant.
Link resisted the urge to snort. He was here for Daruk's benefit, not to start venting about his difficulties since being assigned as the princess's personal knight.
Well, what do you like doing on your free time? Besides eating.
Link smiled. Always a kindred pair, they were.
Besides eating. Well.
Daruk rubbed at his beard.
I like to go up to the peak of Death Mountain. Look down and see Goron City way below me.
He paused.
And gather some prime rock roast to eat.
Daruk had tried to force Link to try that prime rock roast before. Best to be careful on how to proceed.
Rudania is specially made to walk around on Death Mountain, or so the Sheikah say. Seems reasonable to think that it likes to do that too. So. Just take it up there. I don't know if it's that simple, little guy. Sure, it is.
Link laid his pack on the ground, along with the Master Sword, and lay down with his head resting on it.
It is if you tell yourself that you can't leave the Divine Beast until you figure it out.
He considered.
And think about how much easier it'll be to climb Death Mountain on this thing.
He draped an arm over his eyes, enjoying the warmth of the day, thinking that now was as good a time as any to catch a nap. It took Daruk some time. Even while dozing, Link could hear the large Goron stomping around the deck, muttering to himself and occasionally punching something. Little by little, though, Rudania began to respond to his urges. It was just the front legs at first. Then the back. Then its head. And then various other little functions like the vents used to control airflow inside. Link awoke to a sudden lurch. The flat ground underneath him had become an uncomfortably steep slope, giving him the sudden feeling of vertigo. He looked around and saw that Daruk was further forward on the deck, holding onto a section of Rudania while looking ahead. The divine beast was walking forward, climbing over a section of rock, moving in the direction of Death Mountain. Scrambling up to his feet, Link picked up his bag, nestling it in against the control device to prevent it from accidentally rolling off, and shouldering his sword. He carefully made his way over the rocking deck, finally making it to Daruk and grabbing hold of the structure that he was holding onto.
Oh, sorry, little guy. Guess I should have warned you that we're going for a ride.
Daruk grinned down at Link, clearly pleased with himself.
I see you figured it out,
Link said, returning his smile.
Yeah. I think I'm finally getting the hang of this divine beast. Guess I just needed some more time to chip at the bedrock.
Daruk laughed as Rudania crested the ridge and lifted its head, roaring with a thunderous sound that echoed off the canyons and crevices around them. A nearby flock of hot feather pigeons took flight. He felt Rudania level out beneath him. Daruk stretched his arms as though he had been working them hard. How many things had he punched before getting the divine beast under control?
I tell you what, sure is a blast piloting a toy like this around. Now that I've got it figured out, there's going to be no stopping me. You let those other champions know, they better eat their gravel if they want to keep up with Daruk. I'm sure Rivali will appreciate hearing that,
Link said, dryly. Daruk chuckled, patting Link's shoulder, and walked past him, looking around at the view of mountains and rocky outcroppings that surrounded them. Death Mountain smoked overhead, the perpetual thin streams of lava that flowed down its sides glowing warmly.
Speaking of people with their heads in the clouds, can you believe this view?
Daruk waved his arm.
Just look at all those delectable rocks sprinkled on those mountains. Mighty tasty. Like hard candy,
Link said, smirking up at Daruk. Daruk looked down at him, grinning.
Exactly. Knew you would see things my way eventually.
Link patted Daruk's arm. He'd pay for that. Daruk would almost certainly try to convince him to try a rock again. They fell into a comfortable silence for a time before Daruk spoke up again.
I may not know a whole lot about this Calamity Ganon thing, but mark my words, I'll protect this land of ours to the death. Right, little guy.
Daruk slapped Link in the back hard enough to nearly knock him to his knees. Link coughed, holding his back and shooting a glare up at Daruk, who seemed completely oblivious.
So how are things going with you and the princess after being appointed her knight? It's a big deal protecting the king's daughter. No pressure.
Link stood back up, wincing slightly, and glad for the chance to take his time in responding. Finally, he said,
nothing has changed except for that now she has to suffer in my presence all the time, instead of just occasionally.
Daruk frowned.
It can't be all bad. Have you tried talking to her about it?
Link didn't reply. In truth, it wasn't all bad, but it was difficult to pick out good moments. She didn't like him, and she made that perfectly clear. Repeatedly. It was in the tone of her voice when she spoke to him, the disdain and irritation. The way she would often call him hero. But then there were times that she seemed to forget who he was. Perhaps she just forgot he was there altogether. In those times, she changed. She brightened. She talked excitedly about guardians and divine beasts. Or perhaps she found a particular animal, insect, or plant that caught her eye. In those moments, she seemed far more approachable. But then she would look at Link, her smile would fade, and any hope of speaking to her would die on his lips.
Ah,
Daruk said, nodding. He had likely noticed the coolness with which Princess Zelda regarded him since arriving.
The princess is a strong personality, so strong that, sometimes, she can't see the range for the peaks. Remember that, and you'll be fine.
Link had no idea what he even meant by that. Goron idioms could be so difficult to crack. Link opened his mouth to say so, and to tell Daruk that he was confident that the princess had no interest in hearing what Link had to say or thought, when everything began to shake around them. Link stumbled, thinking that Rudania had begun to move on its own, but soon realized that it wasn't just the divine beast. The entire mountain range was trembling with an earthquake that quickly grew violent. Barely keeping on his feet, Link reached out, grabbing Daruk for support. The Goron was solid as always, even as the ground beneath them bucked. Suddenly, Daruk shoved Link behind him and threw his arms to the front. His glowing shield, orange and multi-faceted, appeared to surround the both of them, and a split second later, a massive boulder cracked against it, shattering into smaller pieces that fell to either side of them in a cloud of dust. Daruk left the shield up for another few seconds as the earthquake subsided, scanning the mountain range for any other threats. Finally, he turned back to Link, the shield fading into nothing. He held a hand out, pulling Link to his feet, and then looked back out towards Death Mountain.
That was a little strange. Death Mountain has been quiet for decades. But if it's shivering enough now to...
Daruk glanced at Link, who was brushing himself off. Link saw his eyes briefly flick up to see the leather-wrapped hilt of the Master's sword on his back.
You know what? Never mind. Why don't we get back? I am sure the princess is going to want to hear that I've got this thing figured out.
Link felt a shiver run down his back that had nothing to do with an earthquake. The unspoken fear. The signs. Death Mountain growing active. Monsters appearing in higher numbers and closer to civilization. Rumors of a secret Sheikah sect growing in power. Prophecies. The Master's sword drawn. It all pointed towards the calamity. As Rudania began to turn, its powerful legs bending and stretching to propel it back down the mountain towards its resting place on top of Gortram Mountain, Link couldn't help but to wonder how much time they had left. Would it be enough? Would he be ready? Would any of them? Link stumbled back from the control device, clenching his trembling left hand into a tight fist. His eyes darted around, trying to banish the images from his mind. Daruk, smiling at him. Daruk, laughing. Daruk, confident in their coming victory. It was agonizing to think of what became of his friend in the end. He looked back to the control device, glowing with a soft orange light that was barely visible in the glow of the volcano. Where was Daruk's spirit? For that matter, where was the malice? Where was the creature that he knew controlled this divine beast? It was too quiet. Mipha had greeted Link at the entrance, and the creature had been waiting for them by the control mechanism. So where were they?
Daruk.
Link said, his voice cutting through the quiet.
Daruk, are you here?
He received no response. He began to walk around the upper desk, feeling increasingly uneasy. The back of his neck prickled with the feeling of being watched, yet nothing moved around them. He found out a few moments later why he hadn't seen any of the purple malice anywhere. As he neared the opposite end of the upper neck, near the head, he passed by another section of inset metal sheets and found that several of the sheets had been damaged, bent inward by the force of something striking it. Like a cannonball. Inside, Rudania was dark, but enough light filtered in to reveal a mass of malice that writhed on the interior walls and hung from the ceiling, dripping in large, slow globules. As Link looked down into it, that same unnatural, oily air that he remembered from Ruda's interior seemed to float up from within, making his stomach turn. He pulled back, reaching down and pulling his sword from his waist, activating the blue blade. The light from the sword brought him some measure of comfort, throwing back some of the shadows cast by the magma. He looked around warily, eyes open for any danger. But none came. Why? Where was the creature that he knew inhabited this place? Where was Daruk? Could it be that Mipha had been unique in her spirit's preservation?
Come out and face me,
Link said, voice low, as he stared into the dark mass visible through the broken section of floor. It seemed to respond to his voice, quivering slightly. He held his glowing sword low, casting some of its light down into the hole.
Come out.
There was a definite reaction this time. The malice rippled and shifted, moving away from the light of the sword. An interesting reaction, to be sure, but one that Link didn't have time to focus on. No, because at that moment, he finally heard the voice he had been hoping to hear.
Little guy.
Link whirled, eyes searching, and he found the faint form of Daruk standing behind him. It was more difficult to make him out than it had been to see Mipha, though Link wasn't sure if that was because of the light of the volcano or something else. Daruk smiled broadly at Link.
It's great to see you, brother. I always knew that you would be back. Never stopped believing in you.
Daruk stepped forward, reaching a large hand out to place on Link's shoulder, but it only passed through, leaving the place where he had touched feeling cold. Daruk's face fell.
For a moment, it almost felt like. But no matter. How have you been? What's been going on out there?
Link looked up at Daruk's wide face, smiling weakly.
It's kind of a long story. I fell in battle, and the princess put me in a Sheikah shrine to restore me. It healed me, but it took all of my memories. I was in there for 100 years, Daruk. And the princess has held Ganon back during that time. It's been 100 years.
Daruk said, his tone quiet. He looked out in the direction of Goron City.
I knew it had been a while, but that long.
His shoulders slumped.
Hey. Darbus would be long gone by now. Daruk, you.
They were both interrupted by a new sound. This one came from above. A strange sound. It sounded like yelling. Something suddenly slammed into Rudania, causing the entire divine beast to rock with the impact. Whatever it had been hit not far from where Link and Daruk stood, surrounded by a plume of smoke and dust. As the dust cleared, however, he could see a familiar silhouette uncurling and standing.
Unibo.
The young Goron stepped forward out of the dust, spotting Link, and smiling anxiously.
Am I too late to help?
Rudania roared and, all around them, the sheets of metal that made up the inset flooring slid back, revealing openings that led down into the depths of the divine beast. Malice began to bubble up out of those openings, a dark purple mass that slowly rose, spreading out over the upper deck. The ghostly image of Daruk, who had been staring at Unibo in confusion, whirled to face Link.
It's here.
Link grimaced, thinking that he wished Unibo had gone back to Goron City. He appreciated the Goron's newfound bravery, really, but now he had to not only worry about his own life, but Unibo's as well. Link reached down, patting the arrows at his waist. He wouldn't use them yet. Instead, he removed some of his excess equipment, the paraglider and his satchel, and strapped his shield to his arm. He looked around as the malice began to congregate near the central device. It seemed to congeal and grow upon itself, a mound rising from the center of the mass. The blight began to take shape, growing taller and wider. It was larger than the one in Ruda. Like the other, this one had no legs, its body beginning at its waist, revealing a muscular form. One of its arms were long and slender, in a long-fingered hand. The other arm was thick and covered in Sheikah technology, ending in a massive glowing sword that was not so unlike his own, except for its size. Its face, like the one in Ruda, was covered by a flat mask that contained ancient Sheikah designs, with a blue eye in its center and two protrusions rising from its top that looked like a pair of horns. Red hair sprouted from the back of its head, spreading in all directions. It thrust its head back and shrieked with an ear-piercing roar. Behind him, Link heard Unibo whimper, stumbling back in shock. Link only grimaced, able to hear his pulse pounding in his ears. He was sweating, but the moisture seemed to evaporate almost as immediately as it appeared. It was so damn hot. His eyes found the creature's sword. It was shaped more like a giant cleaver than a sword, short and thick, rather than long and slender. One clean sweep of that, and it was over for him. He wasn't even sure his shield could take it. Sheikah weaponry seemed able to cut through metal and stone. The good wood of his shield would likely put up little resistance to it. The creature's outstretched hand, though those fingers ended in long claws. And Link wasn't sure what other abilities this thing might have.
Careful, Link,
Daruk said, his voice soft so that only Link could hear it.
That thing is tough. I fought it hard, but my boulder breaker couldn't even crack its shell.
He reached out and placed a hand on Link's shoulder. This time, Link could just feel the touch faint, but solid nonetheless. Link looked back at Daruk and gave him a grim smile before stepping forward to face the beast. The creature looked down at Link, turning its head slightly to the side. It seemed to be considering him, confused at the man daring to challenge it. Link brought his ancient sword up to the ready, looking up at the creature. The first attack came quickly, but Link expected it. The giant's sword swung down at Link in an arc, and he leaped to the side, avoiding the blade as it slammed down into the stonework of the divine beast, sinking deeply into it. His shield would most definitely not be any use against that thing. Good to know. The creature wrenched its sword free and advanced on Link, swinging for him again, but this time, Link rolled forward, coming up just underneath its floating form on his knees, and stabbed his sword directly up into the creature's underside.
Yeah, right in the crag.
Daruk pumped his arm into the air.
Don't let up.
The creature screeched in pain and anger, quickly moving away from him. It spun, sweeping its sword out, but Link ducked, feeling it pass overhead, and ran forward, leaping and stabbing his sword up into the place its gut would have been on a normal person. His sword plunged deep into the malice that formed its body. Where the blue blade of his sword touched, the malice quivered and smoked, burned by the energy. He yanked the sword out and aimed a swing up towards the thing's mask, hoping to end the fight as quickly as it started. Before he could land this swing, however, the creature's long arm reached down and grabbed him by the scruff of his tunic, throwing him back. He crashed to the ground, sliding several feet before coming to rest with his head over the edge of one of the openings leading into the belly of the divine beast. Slightly dazed, Link lifted his head to look at the creature, only to see its free hand raised in the air. A ball of yellow fire suddenly appeared above its palm, and it flung the fireball right at Link. Cursing, Link rolled out of the way, but he could still feel the heat of the blast when it struck a few feet away from him. He jumped back to his feet. He ran forward again, knowing that the best place he could be was within the creature's guard. It would have difficulty hitting him with that sword if Link was that close. As he ran, the creature lobbed another fireball at Link, which Link blocked with his shield, which immediately burst into flame. Yelling in surprise, Link stopped his advance, fumbling with the strap on the burning shield. He got it off before it could be completely consumed with flames, and him with it, dropping it to the ground and kicking it away. He saw the cleaver coming for him almost too late. The creature swung low, and Link leaped into a backflip, clearing the blade, but landing again on the edge of the pit. Link momentarily pinwheeled his arms, teetering on the edge, and then he fell back. With a sudden sound of grinding metal, the metal sheets that previously covered the opening slid shut beneath Link, and he landed with a grunt and a clang. He could hear Daruk let out a bellow of triumph, and when Link rolled to his feet, he saw the creature turn on Daruk's spirit, screeching in fury. He lobbed a fireball at Daruk, which passed through him harmlessly.
Not going to work on me, you.
Link stopped listening to whatever Goron vulgarity that Daruk was calling it. Instead, he sprinted towards it and swung his sword up and through the outstretched arm of the creature at the elbow. His blade cut through it in a burst of acrid smoke, and the creature's forearm and hand both fell to the deck, losing their shape and hitting with a sickening sound. Angered and pained, the creature attempted to catch Link with its sword, but Link hadn't stopped moving, getting around to its back, where he aimed a deep cut. It screamed, and Rudani rumbled underneath Link's feet. The creature pulled away, rising into the air above him, and looking down at him with apparent hatred. Link watched, frustrated, as its left arm began to regrow from its smoking stump. It raised its outstretched hand, creating another fireball, but this one, it did not throw towards Link. Instead, it turned the fireball, pressing it to its blue sword.
Oh no!
Link heard Unibo moan from somewhere beside him. He could relate to the sentiment. The creature's cleaver-like sword was suddenly engulfed in fire, seemingly turning its blade orange. It spread its arms wide, releasing an ear-piercing sound, and suddenly it was surrounded by a mostly transparent ball of orange light that caused the air around it to ripple.
That's my move!
Daruk yelled at the same time as Unibo cried,
Hey, that looks just like...
Link deactivated his sword, thrusting it down into his belt, and removed his bow from his back. Fumbling with the quiver at his hip, he pulled out one of the ancient arrows and taking aim at the creature's blue eye. As he drew, the mechanism at the end of the arrow activated, and a small arrowhead appeared, shining with the same light as his sword. Praying that it would work, Link released the arrow, watching it sail through the air, leaving behind a blue afterimage in its wake. It struck the barrier with a brief flash of white-blue light and then dissipated. Link swore. The creature just looked down at Link and raised its hand, palm up. It began as a light wind, a breeze lightly pulling at a few loose strands of Link's hair. But the breeze quickly increased in strength. Just above the creature's outstretched hand, a small ball of white-hot flame appeared. As Link watched and the wind quickly became a gale, pulling towards that ball of light, the fire grew. And grew. Wind howled as, suddenly, Link began to see chunks of molten rock, cooled to mottled black and red by the gale, began to fly towards the fireball, absorbed into it.
Link, run!
Daruk's voice in his head.
Find cover!
Link whirled, eyes darting about, falling on Unibo. He was standing in the open, transfixed. His Goron emblem flapped on his chest, being pulled towards the creature, but held in place by the champion's garment he wore.
Unibo, get out of here!
Link cried as he began running for the Goron. Unibo didn't respond, staring up at the bright fireball with wide eyes. Link could hear Daruk yelling at him, but the pounding of his own heart drowned out the voice.
Unibo!
The gale stopped. Oh no! Link glanced to the right just in time to see the creature lob the fireball, easily as large as any of the boulders that had almost fallen on him earlier, directly towards him. It moved slower than the previous attacks, yet it flew through the air with a strange grace to it, moving with a confident air that suggested that it would succeed. Suddenly, Daruk appeared in front of the fireball, his arms outstretched, yelling in defiance. For a moment, Link had a flash of memory. Daruk, standing before him, protecting him from a boulder that had broken off of Death Mountain and fell towards them. But then Daruk was consumed by the fireball, which continued towards Link, curving slightly, as if to follow him. Yunabo finally seemed to snap out of his daze, and he looked at Link, who waved his hands frantically for him. Yunabo glanced back at the fireball. At Link. He reached out, grabbing Link's arm, and pulled him against his chest, wrapping the Hylian in his arms and ducking his head low. The fireball struck and exploded with the force of Death Mountain's eruption. Fire and molten rock consumed everything in its white-hot fury. The explosion roared in Link's ears, and he waited for the end. An end which never came. Slowly, he opened his eyes, aware that Yunabo was still crushing him to his chest. The Goron was trembling, his head low, eyes closed tightly. Link turned his head, able to see the aftermath of the explosion. The ground around them was blackened and scorched, and flaming embers and ash drifted down around them. A shimmering barrier surrounded them on all sides, encasing them in its protective embrace. They were unharmed. He patted Yunabo's arms, and the Goron slowly released his grip on Link, looking up in wonder. Link pulled away, though did not attempt to leave the barrier. Outside, the creature watched them. Though it made no expression, Link thought that it seemed far more menacing and angry now.
I had no idea you could do that,
Link said, glancing back towards Yunabo.
It's just this ability that I've always had. I've never met anyone else who's ever been able to do it.
Yunabo looked a little sheepish as he looked back down at Link.
I have.
Outside of the barrier, Daruk's ghostly form had reappeared, facing them. He wasn't looking at Link, though. His eyes were on Yunabo, looking stunned. The creature advanced on them, wielding its flaming sword above its head. Yunabo whimpered softly as it did so, but Link stood up straighter, noticing that the creature's own barrier had disappeared. It was vulnerable.
Can this take another hit?
He asked, formulating a plan in his head.
I think so. It takes a lot to break it. This is how you've been surviving everything, isn't it?
Link glanced back at Yunabo.
When you were caught in the rock slide and when you held back the lava. And when I jumped on here. Yunabo, no one should ever suggest to you that you need to be more like Daruk. You're more like Daruk than anyone I've ever met.
Link smiled up at Yunabo's look of surprise.
Now, hold the barrier until I tell you to drop it.
Yunabo nodded, eyes turning back up towards the creature looming over them. It brought its flaming sword down, which struck the barrier with the sound not unlike a hammer striking a gong and an explosion of fire in all directions. The barrier shimmered more brightly under the impact but held. Link pulled another arrow from his quiver, knocking it on his bowstring. He eased around behind Yunabo's back, looking up towards the angry blue eye overhead. The creature swung its sword again, smashing against the barrier with enough force to rock the ground underneath them. Link noticed some cracks forming in the stone under their feet.
After the next hit, wait for the count of 2, and then drop it and run. Understood?
Link spoke in soft tones. He wasn't sure if that creature could understand his words, but he didn't want it to hear, just in case. Yunabo nodded, glancing back over his shoulder at Link. The space in the barrier was tight. The sphere was just tall enough to accommodate Yunabo's height and was equally as wide. The creature screeched again, and suddenly, its eyes flashed with red light. It shot a white beam out from the eye, which crashed against the barrier with another explosion. Link saw white cracks forming in the shimmering surface. 1, 2.
Now.
Yunabo dropped the barrier and immediately curled into a ball, rolling forward and to the right, quickly ending up behind the creature. The creature, however, had Link in its sight. Its eye turned red once more. Link took a breath, feeling everything slow around him as he focused, aiming down the arrow shaft. He released. The ancient arrow flew true, striking the creature dead center of its eye. It sunk deep into the eye, and for a moment, all was still. And then, from within the creature's head, a shaft of brilliant blue-white light exploded out its back.
Yes!
Daruk cried. Behind him, Yunabo pumped his fists into the air. Its sword deactivated as the creature began to thrash, throwing its head back and releasing an ear-piercing shriek. It began to shake violently, backing away from Link as it reached up, clawing at its face with its hand made of malice, which had already begun to grow shriveled and brittle. Suddenly, jets of acrid smoke and mist began to burst out from places all over its body. It curled around itself as more and more of the mist began to erupt from its body until, finally, the entire creature exploded in a cloud of the blackish mist. For a moment, it hung there in the air, swirling slowly, but then it broke apart, rising into the air and fading from view. The scourge of divine beast Varudania was gone. Link barely had a moment to reflect on the victory before he was swept up by massive arms. He released a strangled cry of shock as Unibo lifted him from the ground, causing him to drop his bow to the ground with a clatter.
You did it!
Unibo cried, laughing delightedly. Link merely grunted in reply, finding it difficult to breathe.
Oh. Sorry.
He eased Link back down to the ground. Link backed away a step, brushing his clothes off, before smiling up at Unibo.
We did it! Hey, little guy,
Daruk said, moving closer. His eyes were still on Unibo.
Is this my...
Unibo looked at Daruk and seemed to truly see him for the first time, eyes widening.
You're my grandfather!
For a time, Daruk was speechless, looking at Unibo with an expression of such emotion that would have seemed almost out of place on such a large and imposing being to someone who didn't know him well. Link stepped away, allowing the two Gorons time to speak to each other without his eavesdropping. Instead, he picked up his bow, slinging it over his back, and made his way over to where he had dropped the rest of his supplies. They had, gratefully, avoided damage from the battle, though had clearly gotten pulled towards the creature when it began to charge its fireball. Once he had strapped back on the gear, he pulled a waterskin out, emptying it in several gulps. It was several more minutes before Link heard,
Hey, little guy! What are you doing all the way over there?
Link turned, smiling back at Daruk and Unibo, and made his way back over.
We can't have a proper family reunion without my brother here.
Daruk grinned down at Link.
You know, I may not remember all the finer points of Goron culture, but I'm pretty sure all Gorons refer to each other as brother. Well, sure, but there's a difference between a brother and a brother, you know.
Daruk's grin only grew wider. His form seemed stronger now that the blight had been dealt with.
Link, I'm never going to be able to repay you for all this. Freeing the divine beast and me, bringing my grandson to meet me. He sort of brought himself,
Link interjected, smiling at Unibo's sudden sheepish grin.
But say nothing of it, Daruk. I only wish I could have done so sooner. Doesn't sound like you had much of a choice in that matter either. I'm proud of you. I always knew you were tough for a Hylian, strong enough to give most Gorons a run for their rocks, but now I know you've got what it takes to defeat Calamity Ganon once and for all.
Link exhaled slowly, his body beginning to feel tired again, now that the adrenaline rush was fading.
I've got a long road ahead of me. Still, this is your second divine beast freed, right? I think that thing knew when you crushed the other one. It got really agitated, started thrashing around more than before. Which means the other two are probably going to know I'm coming.
Link didn't like that. He preferred to think that he was getting the drop on these creatures. If they prepared for his arrival, then they would be that much deadlier.
You've got this. Those things won't stand a chance when you roll up to them. And once you've freed them, our century-old Ganon beat-down plan can finally go into effect.
It was hard, thinking of what still lay before him, but still. The knowledge that he had freed Daruk and Mipha and saved their respective peoples gave Link an immense sense of satisfaction.
I'm sorry you've got to walk this path alone, brother. And I had someone try to assassinate me a few days ago,
Link said, smile fading.
Just like old times, then.
Daruk said, laughing. He placed an ethereal hand on Link's shoulder, which Link was able to feel more strongly than before.
Come on, let's get you Unibo down below and strapped in. It's too hot down here for you too. I'll get us out this volcano.
Happy to agree with that idea, the three of them made their way down into the depths of Rudania, which was now clean of the malice that had inhabited it previously. Without that and with the metal vents open, the inside was much brighter than it had been before, letting Link see the complex mechanisms that controlled the divine beast. Daruk led them to a place where a number of seats with a number of restraints like leather belts had been placed. Daruk helped instruct them in how to properly strap themselves in, since Unibo had never been there and Link had no memories of these, and then he turned around, looking around with wonder at the interior of Rudania.
It's been so long since it's been clear of that foul thing,
he said, reaching up and rubbing his beard.
I think it's happy to be free, too. Say, Link, do you remember when you helped me learn how to control this thing?
Link smiled. He did. End of chapter.